Are your mixes holding your band back from getting noticed or signed or getting more work as a producer? Recently, a bunch of you guys submitted your mixes for some brutally honest feedback, and I'm going to try and give some advice on how to course correct some of these mix mistakes. A great mix is always going to make you want to hear more. It can be really satisfying, even if you don't like the music. I actually started listening to a bunch of bands I never would have given the time of day to because I was such a fan of the producers that they worked with, and with time I just grew to love the music. So make sure you're always striving to get the best tones possible. Now, I don't know what to expect here. I'm just going to pick a bunch at random. My assumption is that overheads are going to be the most overlooked element in these mixes, and that was definitely true for my mixes back in the day as well. If you want to submit your mixes for one of these videos in the future, sign up to the mailing list. The link is in the description, and you'll also receive some mixing tips and tricks and advice there as well. Okay, so let's listen to some of your mixes. So I'm just going to pick a bunch at random, checking this one out first. Razor Grave, Beyond the Flesh. Let's have a listen. First thing I can hear, it sounds like the guitar is a little bit louder in my right ear, so I don't know if the tones are different or the play's different or something's going on there. I would usually automate kicks down just a tiny bit for sections of really fast double pedal, and it sounds like they're just the same level, which isn't the end of the world. Vocals are quite loud, but vocals being too loud versus too quiet is better, in my opinion. Better to be too loud. I'm not saying these are too loud, they're quite loud. The first thing that I hear is it's got quite a lot of reverb to them. Now, obviously this is kind of old school thrash. Maybe that's the aesthetic they're going for. I personally find this reverb a bit kind of washy and a bit too much like murkiness in there. But my personal preference is not really hearing much delay or reverb on vocals. A couple of my favourite records as a kid, the first Slipknot record and Great Southern Trainkill, and both those records sound like the vocals are super dry and they're just screaming in your face. Maybe there was reverb or delay on those vocals, but you can't really hear it in the mix context if there is. Definitely not the worst mix I've heard. Not a lot to be, roasted or critiqued. I think it's in a pretty good place in general, and some of those changes for me would just be kind of like personal preference. Cymbals. That's the first problem with this mix. There's just like a really kind of harsh top end, like shh, coming from one of those crashes. By the sound of that drum fill, these are real drums. There's a little bit of flamming between the feet and the hands, but I think these are real. Now I like that the cymbals are at a decent volume, you can hear them. A lot of people kind of bury their cymbals, but there's quite a harsh like shh coming from one of those crashes that could be controlled a bit. Bass tone is really great as well. If this is all real kick, or maybe there's sample in there, or it's fully sample replaced, a sample usually gives just a bit more consistency to the kicks, which I personally like in metal. Where the high end is placed, it sounds like it's like maybe like a D6 microphone or something, I could be wrong, or a D112. The high end could be shifted down a little bit, more focused around like 4K. I don't know if that's like a 91 or like a D6 or D112 microphone, but getting a good solid sample or a different type of sample tucked under that would kind of help me, I think, with this mix. Yeah, it's just those cymbals, they're killing me. Could go a little bit tighter with the drum editing on this one, but I've just imported a bit into Cubase, and I'm going to try and find that problematic kind of cymbal frequency area that could be tamed. Hard to do within the context of an entire mix, but yeah, it's kind of tough to do, just trying to filter out just what I'm hearing in the cymbals that I don't like. I think the problem a lot of people find is the 3K area can be really harsh on cymbals. And depending on the room and the overheads, people kind of cut this area out quite a lot, and I do as well. But it means that you're leaving in a lot up here. And if you're cutting a lot of low end and not killing much up here, you're going to kind of essentially have the equivalent of just boosting this area by removing everything else. So you're just kind of putting emphasis around here. So it's kind of a fine balancing act, getting that right. And don't be afraid to do low pass filtering on cymbals if they are particularly bright. So that could be something that could really help this mix. So the kick drum's pretty obnoxious. I would say, again, this is personal preference, the high end is placed a little bit too high on the kick. It's quite kind of ticky and annoying, and the way the kick and the high end on the toms comes through is a bit kind of splatty. I like to focus my high end more around like 3 to 4, 5K around there, and kind of taper off above 6K. And this sounds like you weren't getting enough of that clarity that comes through in that kind of 2 to 5K area. So instead of boosting that area, you've just boosted the level of the whole kick. That's what it sounds like. Overheads could come up a little bit. The guitar tone has a hint of Boss Metal Zone about it. It's kind of scooped, but I kind of like scoop tones, to be honest, so it's not the worst tone in the world. So I've imported it into Cubase. Let's see if that 6K trick I do might help this kind of fizzy guitar tone. Wow, they are scooped. Yeah, you got a bigger, the entire mix is scooped. Now I'm doing this to the entire mix, but this is what I'd want to do for the guitar tone. So ignore what this is doing to the cymbals. So it's rare you'll see me boosting mids, but this is so scooped that I think it needs a little bit around here. So we're just going to be listening to the guitars. This is with it off. So the guitar tone could improve the entire mix. Okay, there you go. Thrash, let's go. Nothing really that stands out as bad to be like roasted in this one. It's kind of a bit more stripped back. It's not overproduced, which is cool. Definitely fits the vibe. The kick drum is the main thing that sticks out to me that could be improved upon. It sounds like these are all just natural drums and there's no samples. And if there are, maybe that's the room mic sample, maybe that's just the rooms and the kick in the rooms and it's all natural. Not much to complain about with this one. For me, it's just the kick, and depending on the kick you use on the microphones, and if you want to keep everything all natural, it can be tricky, particularly in fast metal, to get your kicks sounding exactly how you want them, particularly if you're really used to hearing triggered and sample replaced kick drums. But this kick isn't horrific, but it's the one thing to me that I'd want to try and improve upon. This is kind of tricky stuff to mix because you want everything to be super loud, super prominent, and especially when you've got vocals like that you really want the clarity there for the vocals. So generally speaking, the mix is sounding good. The vocals are nice and loud, which is good. The main problem to me is the snare. Just isn't really coming through how I'd like it to. Overheads, again, they could be just a little darker, especially this kind of music where you want to leave a lot of that top end space and give it to the vocals. So they could be a little bit darker, and maybe it's like the master bus processing, like, or the limiter just bringing the snare level down and the snare could come up. But either way, the snare, it's, at least in these headphones, it's quite quiet, so I'm kind of struggling to hear it. Just some balancing, maybe going a little less heavy-handed with the mix compression, master bus compression, and limiting. It's kind of hard to know exactly what's going on, but I think a lot of people are trying to get their masters as loud as possible to compete with all these Spotify playlists. Sometimes if your mix isn't balanced out right, your whole mix is going to suffer, and sometimes you're going to just completely kill your snare drum. And that's the main thing I'm hearing in these heavy sections. That's the problem, the snare. It's a little bit too trashy for me as well, like maybe, I don't know, overly saturated, or either the sample or the room mics, whatever's used it's hard to identify exactly in the mix. Maybe there are some frequencies on that snare that are ringing out a little bit too loud that could be filtered out as well. Sometimes taking a little bit of the fundamental out of your snare drum can just help kind of balance out that area, so it's not just like So this area in general, around 896, I don't know if that's coming through on the snare mic or the snare samples or the snare in the room mics, but it's pretty kind of trashy sounding. And for this sort of music, this like kind of more high tune snare doesn't seem to kind of work as well. You don't often hear this more, I don't want to say poppy, I don't mean that in a negative way, but type of music with this type of snare. Normally you hear a bit of a fatter, more kind of radio rock friendly snare, and this one's a little bit more like, got some of that deathcore ping to it. And I can just see that. Is that a cymbal or a guitar? Going to absolutely kill this mix with all these filtered notched frequencies. So let's just listen to the snare drum in particular, and I'm going to turn this off and then on. So the mix wasn't horrible, but the snare was the main problem for me in that mix. And again, maybe some of the master bus processing could be readdressed. It sounds like a guitarist has programmed the drums, because it sounds like the sort of thing a real drummer wouldn't necessarily play for a lot of this. I haven't heard the whole song yet. Guitarists love programming ding 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 little simple stuff all the time. The snare sounds kind of dull. It's got a bit of that sort of like overly tape saturation vibe, but it's kind of got a bit of that wood blocky sound to it. Cymbals, yeah, I think because they're playing sort of, it just doesn't feel like what a drummer would instinctively play. It just feels kind of a bit weird and robotic, and the placements are a bit off. It's kind of throwing me, but the cymbals are maybe a little bit too bright as well. Yeah, the snare can be a little bit brighter, and just kind of taming that kind of boxiness would be the main thing, I think. So something is kind of clicky and weird sounding. I don't know if it's the bass or like the top end on the toms on the fills, but I think it's maybe a bit of both, but I think it's the bass guitar. Yeah, it sounds like a bit of that kind of fieldy from Korn, kind of like clank. Clank? More like rattle. Tinny. There's a really weird like ooh coming through on the ride there. The high end on the toms is pretty full on as well. The bass rattle is kind of a bit off-putting to me, I think. It can be tricky though, because some bass players, particularly if they play with their fingers and they're adamant that they want that rattly sound, getting that to work in the mix, especially like faster music like this, is kind of tricky. If you're doing a band and you want to sound exactly like Korn, and stylistically the music sounds like Korn, then you can make it happen. But if you're like, I want the Korn bass tone, and then you play like thrashy fast stuff, it doesn't really work. But it's not a horrible mix. That was just the first thing that came out to me. To be honest, a lot of these mixes, they sounded pretty good. Could be wrong, but that sounds like the intro fill to the Hard Law podcast, which I love. So I don't know what they've used for the drums for this, but they sound very much programmed. It sounds like the snare, it doesn't sound like there's many like round robins or variation on the samples, even like the room mics. It sounds like someone's going, hey, 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 but it's just like, I think the snare room mic. Generally though, the mix isn't terrible. I don't think it's a bad mix. I think stylistically, probably going for something like Throne, and the mix kind of lives in that world. I think the cymbals could be tamed a bit. I think if you're not already using Soothe, maybe a bit of that could help. Now I know this sort of recording and this type of music, you really want it to just to feel and sound really heavy and aggressive and abrasive. So you don't want everything to be just completely smoothed out and nullified. But yeah, the cymbals are just maybe a little bit too kind of thin sounding. I like that they're quite loud. Loud cymbals, it can be kind of harsh if they're, you know, quite bright like this, but loud cymbals does add to heaviness. So I've imported this into Cubase. Let's just try and tackle the overheads, and I'm just going to be listening to them. So what I'm doing to the entire mix, I'm going to be listening into the overheads. They're just a lot brighter than the rest of the mix, and they kind of just take your ear away from everything, and they're not quite gelling with the rest of it. Someone that I think gets really good overhead sounds for like modern metalcore or like hardcore and that kind of stuff, who I've worked with in the sense that I was in Architects and he mixed the last few Architects records that I played on, and he's obviously mixed, I assume he's mixed the most recent Architects record, but his overheads have a really cool kind of pumping characteristic which adds to some heaviness, mixes them quite loud, but they're never too bright and harsh, and they leave a lot of space up the top of the mix for the vocal. Getting your overhead balance right is really tricky. The balance of getting rid of some of the more harsh and annoying and fatiguing frequencies without being left with all the stuff that's just really bright and annoying, kind of sits kind of disjointed like this on top of the whole mix. Now this is not a bad mix, I think they've done a really good job, but I think this overhead harshness and brightness could come down a bit. So let's just do a quick A-B again. And again, I think overheads add to heaviness, so I like that they've got them quite loud. But I think these are program drums, so maybe just having them a little less harsh and just kind of sitting in with the rest of the mix in terms of not being too disjointed. Other than that, the kick drum could do with just being a little bit more focused, maybe the attack, and maybe if they don't want it like ultra clicky, ultra metal sounding, but not a bad sound. Maybe it's quite deliberate. Maybe they're probably not going for something like ultra clicky, like I said, for this sort of music. Generally speaking, really great mix, great work. So thank you to everyone that submitted their mixes for feedback. And if you want to submit some of your mixes in the future for one of these videos, join the mailing list, the link's in the description. And if you think you're making any of these mixing errors, particularly when it comes to things like mixing drums and pesky overheads, then check this video out next.